My father pointed to the door and called me a failure in front of the entire party, desperate to protect his stepdaughter's fragile ego. He believed he was saving the family reputation, but he had no idea I was the one holding the deed to the venue. I walked out wearing a cheap coat, clutching a secret worth $3 billion. One phone call is all it will take to turn his world upside down tonight. My name is Rowan Hart. I am 34 years old, and if you saw me walking down the street in my beige wool coat that has started to pill at the elbows, you would not look twice. That is entirely by design. I stood outside the Gilded Oak, the premier event venue in Larkhaven, Illinois, watching the autumn wind whip dead leaves across the parking lot. The building loomed ahead, spilling golden light onto the pavement, promising warmth and judgment in equal measure. My father, Graham Hart, had made it clear that my attendance tonight was not optional. He called it a mandatory family gathering, a phrase he wielded like a gavel. The occasion was a celebration for Brielle Vale, his stepdaughter. Rumor had it she had secured a senior management position or perhaps an engagement to a man with an acceptable portfolio. It did not matter which. To Graham, Brielle was the trophy child, the one who validated his ego. He needed an audience for her glory, and he needed his biological daughter there to serve as the contrast. I would have stayed in my apartment if it were not for the message I received from my younger brother. Caleb, 2 hours ago. Please, Ro. The text had read, just come for an hour. I can't take it anymore. The way they talk about you when you aren't here, it makes me sick. Just show up and let them see you're okay. Caleb was the only reason I still tethered myself to this family. For him, I shifted the paper bag in my arms. Inside was a bottle of Cabernet that cost $12 at the corner store. It was my costume prop, to my father and his circle. I was Rowan the failure, the disappointment. Graham had kicked me out of the house when I was 19 because I refused to major in business at the state university. For 15 years, he had spun a narrative to our relatives that I was a drifter, living paycheck to paycheck, unable to find my footing in the real world. I never corrected him. Silence was a shield. If they thought I was struggling, they did not ask where I actually went during the day. They did not ask about the investments, the acquisitions, or the quiet empire I had built while they were busy polishing their social standing. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen protector was cracked, another deliberate detail I maintained to sell the illusion of poverty. I opened an encrypted messaging app and found the contact saved simply as Mara. My fingers moved quickly against the cold glass. If things go too far tonight, activate Plan B. I hit send and watched the delivery receipt turn solid. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, took a breath that tasted of exhaust and rain, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was suffocatingly warm and smelled of expensive perfume and roasting meat. A young man in a crisp vest stood behind a high podium, managing the guest list on a tablet. He looked bored, tapping the screen with a rhythmic, impatient motion. Name he asked without looking up. Rowan Hart, I said. He scrolled down the list, his expression flat. Then his finger stopped. He froze. The rhythmic tapping ceased. He blinked once, then twice, before looking up at me. His eyes darted from my scuffed boots to my cheap coat, and then back to the name on his screen. It was the look of someone whose reality had just glitched. He had seen my name before, but not on a standard guest list. He had seen it on the venue's internal ownership directives, the kind that staff were never supposed to discuss with the general public. Ms. Hart, he stammered, his voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't realize you would be present tonight. Do we need to alert management? No, I said, keeping my face completely blank. I am just here for the party. The air inside the ballroom was thick enough to choke on, smelling of roasted garlic and heavy designer perfumes. I stepped through the double doors and immediately realized my mistake. This was not a family dinner. This was a Vanity Fair. My father, Graham, stood in the center of the room under the crystal chandelier, holding a flute of champagne and laughing a little too loudly at a joke made by a local zoning commissioner. He was not there to celebrate a daughter. He was there to cement his status as the benevolent patriarch of Larkhaven. Then I saw Brielle. She was standing next to him, radiant in a dress that shimmered like liquid silver. Her hair was pinned up in a complex style that likely took 3 hours to perfect. When her eyes landed on me, the perfect hostess smile did not waver, but her eyes went cold. It was the look one gives to a splash of red wine on a white carpet. She did not see a sister. She saw a problem that needed to be scrubbed away. Graham spotted me and waved me over. The motion was stiff, authoritative. As I approached, the circle of guests turned their attention to me. I felt their gazes rake over my worn coat and my lack of jewelry. "And this is my other daughter, Rowan," Graham announced. His voice dripped with a performative sadness, a tone designed to solicit sympathy for himself. "She is a bit of a free spirit. You know how it is. She likes to live unpredictably. Not quite settled down like Brielle here." A ripple of polite, condescending laughter moved through the group. They nodded, sipping their drinks, categorizing me instantly as the black sheep. "She's doing fine." "Dad," Caleb said, stepping forward from the edge of the circle. His face was flushed with embarrassment. "Rowan is doing just Caleb." Graham cut him off, his voice sharp and final. "You worry about your own career. Do not interrupt the adults." Brielle took a delicate sip of her drink and sighed, drawing the attention back to herself. She placed a manicured hand on Graham's arm. "It is okay, Graham. We just want Rowan to be happy," Brielle said, her voice sugary sweet. She looked at the guests with wide, innocent eyes. "I just wish she would call us for something other than money. The last time she asked my mother for a loan. Well, we did not hear from her for 6 months afterward. The lie was so bold, so effortlessly delivered, that I almost admired the craftsmanship. I had never borrowed a cent from her mother. In fact, I had anonymously paid off her mother's car loan 2 years ago." Graham shook his head, looking at me with profound disappointment. "I know, sweetheart. We do what we can." The circle of guests looked at me with open judgment now. They were waiting for me to scream, to deny it, to cause a scene that would justify their gossip. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I kept my face impassive. "May I just get a glass of water?" I asked quietly. My calmness seemed to infuriate them more than an outburst would have. It denied them the drama they craved. Graham's face turned a shade of red that clashed with his tie. He viewed my lack of shame as an act of rebellion. He stepped forward and snatched the empty glass I had just picked up from a passing tray. The crystal clattered as he slammed it back onto the waiter's platter. "Do not embarrass me," Graham hissed, loud enough for the entire side of the room to hear. "You come in here looking like a beggar, disrespecting your sister's big night with your attitude. I will not have it. You do not belong here." He raised his hand and signaled 2 large men in dark suits standing by the exit. "Get her out," Graham commanded, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "Do not let her dirty Brielle's day any further." The security guards moved in fast. I felt a heavy hand clamp onto my upper arm and another on my shoulder. They did not drag me, but they guided me with a force that made it clear I had no choice. As I was marched backward toward the lobby, I caught one last glimpse of the head table. The music had not stopped. The guests were already turning back to their conversations, and Brielle stood there, watching me leave, letting out a soft, satisfied breath as if she had just won a game that I did not even know we were playing. The lobby floor was polished marble, cold and hard beneath my boots. The sound of the party faded into a muffled thrum behind the heavy double doors, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my father's dress shoes following close behind. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a potent mixture of adrenaline and focused rage. The security guards did not speak. They simply propelled me forward, their hands heavy on my shoulders, treating me like a volatile object that needed to be discarded before it exploded. Graham walked beside us, his face twisted in a sneer that he usually reserved for incompetent employees. He leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "You always do this." Graham spat, refusing to look me in the eye. "You cannot stand to see Brielle shine. You have to drag your misery in here and smear it over everyone else. You are a disgrace. Rowan, you do not belong here. You never did." We reached the glass exit doors. The automatic sensors slid them open, letting in a gust of biting Illinois wind. The guards pushed me out onto the concrete, releasing their grip only when I was fully outside the threshold. I stumbled slightly but caught my balance. I turned to face him. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply looked at the man who had raised me and felt the final thread of attachment snap. "Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the cold. "Are you sure you know who I am?" Graham let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cruel sound. "I know exactly who you are. You are a 34-year-old failure who just got thrown out of her sister's party." Behind him, the doors slid open again. Brielle stepped out, flanked by 3 of her friends. She pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes wide with feigned terror. Several guests had followed her, and I saw the distinct glow of smartphone screens rising in the darkness. They were recording. "Please," Brielle cried out, her voice pitching up for the cameras. She is having an episode. Just let her go. She came here to hurt me." "She is not well. That is enough." Caleb's voice rang out. He pushed through the crowd of onlookers, his face pale. He reached for me, but a hand shot out from the shadows near the valet stand, blocking his path. A man in a charcoal suit stood there. He was nondescript, the kind of man you would forget 5 seconds after meeting him, which made him excellent at his job. He spoke to Caleb in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet it carried clearly in the night air. "Stay back. Caleb, I am Rowan's lawyer. I arrived earlier than expected." Caleb froze. Before he could ask a question, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. It had no logos, no flags, just dark-tinted windows that reflected the neon lights of the venue. The rear door opened. Mara stepped out. She was a woman in her 50s who wore authority like a second skin. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she held a thin leather folder. She did not look at me. She did not ask if I was okay. She walked straight up to the head of security, a man twice her size, and stopped 3 inches from his chest. "Who is the shift supervisor tonight?" Mara asked. Her tone was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying clarity. The guard blinked, taken aback. "I am, and you need to back away. Ma'am, I want the name of the individual who ordered the physical removal of a guest listed as a protected attendee on the venue's internal registry." Mara said. The words hung in the air like smoke. The guard's confidence faltered. He looked at his partner, then back at Mara. "Protected attendee I didn't see any." "She is my daughter," Graham shouted, stepping between Mara and the guard. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain control of the narrative, and I told them to remove her. "I have the right to decide who attends my family event." Mara finally turned her head. She looked at Graham with the dispassionate interest of a scientist observing a bug under a microscope. She opened the leather folder and pulled out a single, thin envelope. "You have rights?" Mara asked, arching one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "With what capacity do you claim rights in this building?" "Mr. Hart." I did not turn back to the party immediately. I stood on the sidewalk, letting the biting wind numb the heat in my cheeks. It was a familiar cold. It reminded me of the winter 10 years ago when I had made the decision to legally separate my public identity from the family name. I had buried Rowan Hart under layers of bureaucratic static so dense that even the private investigators Graham occasionally hired had hit a wall. To my family, I was a ghost who drifted between dead-end jobs. To the global financial sector, I was the silent architect behind Orchid Rail, the payment infrastructure grid that currently processed transactions for nearly 40% of the retail chains in North America. When I stepped back from the public eye after the company went public, I did not leave with a golden parachute. I left with a controlling interest and a diversified portfolio that had quietly matured into a net worth hovering around $3 billion. I did not hoard the money for yachts or penthouses. I used it to buy safety. I used it to buy the kind of freedom that meant no one could ever tell me where to stand or when to leave again. I looked up at the imposing stone facade of the Gilded Oak. Graham believed he was renting this space from a prestigious local property group. He had no idea that the holding company listed on the deed was a subsidiary of a blind trust I controlled. Technically, I was not just the unwanted guest he had thrown out on the street. I was his landlord. Mara stepped away from the stunned security team, leaving them to whisper frantically into their radios. She walked over to me, her heels clicking on the pavement, and opened her folder, shielding the documents from the prying camera lenses of the guests still lingering near the glass doors. The preliminary forensic audit on the Valacrest initiative is complete, Mara said, her voice dropping to a register that only I could hear. It is exactly as you suspected. The charity is a sieve. Brielle is using her position as ambassador to funnel donations into 3 different shell companies based in the Caribbean. The money is not building schools or feeding the hungry. It is looping through a wash cycle and landing in accounts linked to Jonah Reed. She is using the family name as collateral, I said, the pieces locking together in my mind. Graham is signing guarantees he does not understand, isn't he? He has co-signed 4 separate liquidity loans in the last 6 weeks. Mara confirmed. If this house of cards collapses, he loses everything. The house, the pension, the reputation he values more than his own blood. This was the reason I had come tonight. It was not to beg for a seat at the table. It was because I suspected Brielle was not merely mean. She was a criminal. She was constructing a massive fraud on the foundation of my father's arrogance, using his desperate need to feel important as the mortar. Do we drop the hammer now? Mara asked, looking at the building with disdain. I can have the venue manager shut this event down in 5 minutes. We can freeze the assets before the dessert is served. I looked through the thick glass doors. Inside, under the warm glow of the chandeliers, I could see Graham straightening his tie. He was sweating, his face red with exertion as he tried to usher guests back toward the bar, desperate to pretend the scene outside had never happened. He looked small. He looked terrified of the truth. No, I said, not yet. If we stop it now, he will just blame me for ruining the night. He will never believe she is guilty. He needs to see it. He needs to be given the choice. I wanted to give him one last opportunity to be a father, or at least a man of integrity. I would put the truth in front of him and see if he picked it up, or if he stepped over it to protect his delusion. I stepped closer to the glass, watching Brielle laugh at something a waiter said, her hand resting possessively on Graham's shoulder as if she owned him. If Dad needs a daughter to protect, I whispered against the cold pane. Tonight he will see the cost. I signaled to the doorman, and he pulled the heavy oak handle without hesitation. I did not sneak back into the room. I walked through the main entrance with Mara on my right and the lawyer on my left, moving with the measured cadence of someone inspecting their own property. The chatter in the room died down instantly, replaced by the sharp click of my boots on the parquet floor. We cut a path straight through the crowd, parting the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Graham saw me first. He was in the middle of a toast, his glass raised high, but when he spotted me, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He slammed his glass down onto the nearest table, spilling champagne over a white tablecloth. "I told you to get out," Graham screamed, his voice cracking with the force of his anger. He marched toward me, looking around wildly for the security guards. "Where is security?" I gave a direct order. Do your jobs and remove this trespasser." The two guards started to move forward, their expressions grim, but before they could take more than 2 steps, the venue manager, a man named Mr. Sterling, who usually remained invisible during events, sprinted from the shadows. He did not run to Graham, he ran to me. He stopped 2 feet away, smoothed his jacket, and bowed his head slightly. It was a small gesture, but in a room obsessed with hierarchy, it was a thunderclap. "Ms. Hart," Mr. Sterling said, his voice respectful and loud enough to carry, "I apologize for the disturbance. Is there anything you require from my staff?" The room went silent. The air left the room. Graham froze mid-stride, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He looked from the manager to me, his brain failing to compute why the help was bowing to the unwanted daughter. Brielle saw the shift. She saw the guests exchanging confused whispers, and she realized the spotlight was slipping away from her. She needed a villain, and she needed one fast. She gasped loudly, a theatrical sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Her hands flew to her neck, clutching at the empty space where a diamond pendant had been resting just moments ago. "My necklace," Brielle shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "It is gone, She bumped into me in the lobby earlier. She stole it, that is why she came back, to see if I noticed it was a clumsy lie, desperate and thin. But Graham snatched it up like a lifeline. It gave him a reason to hate me that felt righteous." "You thief!" Graham spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "I knew it. I knew you were desperate for money. You come in here and rob your own sister. I have not touched her," I said calmly. My voice was level, contrasting sharply with the hysteria rising around the head table. "I am calling the police," Graham shouted, tapping the screen with shaking fingers. "I have to protect my daughter from you. You are going to jail tonight." Rowan. The guests were no longer pretending to look away. They were standing on their tiptoes, phones raised, hungry for the downfall. They wanted the mugshot. They wanted the scandal. "Go ahead and call," my lawyer said. He stepped forward, adjusting his cuffs. "But be aware that filing a false police report is a felony in the state of Illinois, and accusing my client of theft in front of 200 witnesses constitutes defamation per se." Brielle's eyes darted around the room. She realized the theft accusation might be too easy to disprove if they searched me right there. She needed something visceral. She needed a physical assault. She took a step toward me, her eyes manic. "Give it back. You always take everything." Then she threw herself backward. It was a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. She flailed her arms and collapsed onto the carpet, knocking over a chair on her way down. She curled into a ball, sobbing. "She pushed me," Brielle wailed, burying her face in her hands. "She pushed me down. Dad." "Make her stop!" Graham roared. He lunged toward me, but Mara stepped in his path, her face like granite. "Look up! Graham!" I said, pointing to the dark domes on the ceiling. "Those are 4K security cameras. They cover every inch of this room. They are recording at 60 frames per second. Do you really want the police to see the tape? Graham did not look up. He was too far gone in his savior complex. I saw what I saw. Police now. We did not have to wait long. The blue lights were already flashing against the tall windows before the sirens cut through the music. 2 officers entered the room, their hands resting on their belts. Graham rushed to them, pointing at me with the conviction of a man who believes he writes the laws. "Arrest her," Graham demanded, breathless. "She stole jewelry and she assaulted my daughter. I want her in handcuffs immediately." The lead officer, a tall sergeant with a tired face, looked at Graham. Then he looked at Brielle, who was still sobbing on the floor but peeking through her fingers. "Finally." He looked at me. I stood perfectly still, The sergeant did not reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he turned his back on Graham and walked straight to Mr. Sterling, the manager, who reported the disturbance the officer asked, taking out a notepad, and more importantly, I need to know who holds the signatory power on the rental contract for this building. Mr. Sterling looked at me for permission. I gave a barely perceptible nod. The gentleman reported the disturbance. Mr. Sterling said, gesturing to Graham. But the building is under the ownership of the Hartwell Trust. The contract holder is standing right there. He pointed at me. Graham's arm dropped to his side. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. The police officer turned back to my father, his expression shifting from boredom to suspicion. "Sir," the officer said to Graham, "if you are not the property owner or the contract holder, then technically, we need to ask her if she wants to press charges for trespassing." Mr. Sterling did not hesitate. He unclipped a thick document from his tablet case and handed it to the sergeant. The paper was heavy stock, the kind used for binding legal agreements that involved liability clauses and six-figure deposits. The room was so quiet that the sound of the pages turning seemed to echo off the vaulted ceiling. "This is the execution copy of the venue lease for tonight," Mr. Sterling said, his voice projecting a practiced neutrality. "As you can see, the signatory is not Mr. Graham Hart. The event was booked and paid for by the Hartwell Trust. The authorized representative on site is Ms. Rowan Hart." Graham stared at the document as if it were written in an alien language. His face went slack. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to reconcile the reality on the paper with the narrative he had built in his head. "That is impossible," Graham stammered, his voice losing its booming authority. "I gave Brielle the money. I wrote the check myself. She told me she handled the booking under the family name." "She handled the booking, sir," Mr. Sterling corrected gently, "but the funds she used to secure the date did not come from your personal account. They came from a third-party transfer that flagged our compliance software, which is why the Hartwell Trust, the actual property owner, stepped in to underwrite the liability. Your daughter, Ms. Vale, is listed merely as the event coordinator, not the client." Brielle stopped sobbing. The sudden silence from her corner was more telling than any confession. She looked at Graham, her mascara smeared, realizing the financial shell game she had been playing was beginning to crack. I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cadence of a boardroom meeting. "Officer," I said, "as the legal representative of the property owner, I am formally requesting that we review the security footage from the last 10 minutes. I believe it will clarify the accusation regarding the necklace and the alleged assault." The sergeant nodded and motioned for Mr. Sterling to bring up the feed on a portable monitor. The crowd of guests, who had been ready to jeer at me moments ago, now leaned in with a morbid curiosity. The screen flickered to life. The high-definition footage was merciless. It showed the timeline clearly. At 8:42, Brielle was standing near the buffet. She looked over her shoulder, checking for witnesses. Then, with a quick, practiced movement, she unclasped her diamond necklace. She did not drop it. She did not lose it. She handed it to her best friend, a woman in a green dress standing right next to her, who immediately slipped the jewelry into her clutch purse. 2 minutes later, on the tape, Brielle threw herself onto the floor while I was standing a full 3 feet away from her. The sergeant watched the clip twice. He paused it on the frame where the necklace disappeared into the purse. He looked up at Brielle, his eyes hard. "Ms. Vale," the sergeant said, his voice dropping an octave. "Filing a false police report is a Class 4 felony. So is attempted insurance fraud, if you were planning to claim that necklace." The air in the room shifted instantly. The whispers turned into gasps. The guests backed away from Brielle as if she were contagious. She looked around, her face pale, searching for an escape route that did not exist. I was just confused," Brielle stuttered, her voice trembling. I felt a push. "That is enough," the officer said, reaching for his radio. We need to take a statement. Then, Graham moved. He stepped between the officer and Brielle. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. He looked at the footage, then at the weeping stepdaughter who had played him for a fool, and finally at me. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He knew she was guilty. He knew she had lied to him, stolen from him, and used him. But admitting that meant admitting he had been wrong about me for 15 years. It meant admitting his golden child was rot. He could not do it. It was a misunderstanding, Graham said loudly, his voice desperate. I told her to take the necklace off. It was loose. She was just overly emotional. There is no crime here. He was lying to the police to save her. He was willing to obstruct justice, to humiliate himself, just to keep the illusion alive. I felt a cold hollowness open up in my chest. I signaled the lawyer to hold back. I walked up to my father, close enough that no one else could hear us over the murmuring crowd. "Dad," I said softly, "look at me. The camera does not lie. She set me up. She set you up. You can stop this right now. You can apologize, tell the truth, and walk away. I will not embarrass you further. I will make this disappear. It was a lifeline. It was the last olive branch I had left to give." Graham looked down at me. For a second, I saw fear in his eyes, but then the pride took over again, hardening his features like concrete setting in the sun. He leaned in, his breath sour with champagne. "I do not need your help," Graham hissed, "and I do not need you. Get out of my sight." He turned his back on me and put his arm around Brielle, shielding the liar from the consequences and slamming the door on me forever. I sat in the back of the black sedan, the heated leather seat doing little to thaw the ice in my veins. The party was behind us, a glowing box of noise and lies. But the real work was just beginning. Mara did not waste time with pleasantries. She opened her tablet, the blue light illuminating her sharp features, and turned the screen toward me. "We have the transaction logs for the Valcrest initiative," Mara said, her finger tracing a jagged line on a graph. "Brielle is not just bad at math. Rowan, she is running a laundromat. The charity raised $2 million in the last quarter alone. Less than 5% of that went to actual aid programs. I looked at the names of the recipient companies. They were generic, soulless titles like North Star Logistics and Riverbed Consulting. They are shell companies, I said, recognizing the pattern immediately. "Who is the beneficiary?" Mara tapped the screen once. A photo popped up. It was a face I had seen smiling in the society pages next to Brielle for the last year. Handsome, polished, and completely hollow. "Jonah Reed," Mara said, "her fiancé. He is not a venture capitalist. He is moving illicit funds for an offshore gambling syndicate, and he is using Brielle's clean reputation to wash the cash. She is the face, but he is the architect." I felt a wave of nausea. Brielle was not just mean. She was being used, and she was likely too vain to realize it. But the next document Mara swiped to made my blood run cold. It was a loan guarantee for $500,000, signed 3 weeks ago. The signature at the bottom was shaky but unmistakable Graham Hart. "He thinks he is investing in her future," I whispered. "He has no idea he is co-signing a federal crime." There was a frantic tapping on the window. I looked up to see Caleb, breathless and shivering in his suit jacket. I unlocked the door, and he scrambled inside, slamming it shut against the wind. "I saw you leave," Caleb gasped, wiping sweat from his forehead. He is losing it in there. He is telling everyone you are mentally unstable, but I know he is lying." "Caleb," I said, keeping my voice steady, "what do you know about Jonah?" Caleb hesitated, looking down at his hands. "I never liked him. He is too smooth. But it is more than that. I caught Brielle going through Dad's wallet last month. She took his driver's license and his social security card. When I asked her about it, She said, she was just updating his insurance information for the wedding. She was stealing his identity to validate the loans, I said, looking back at the tablet. There is one more thing, Mara interrupted, her voice dropping lower. The primary creditor for Graham's personal loan, the one Brielle convinced him to take out to cover the venue deposit, it is held by Apex Ventures. I stared at the screen. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Apex Ventures was a mid-tier risk fund that I had acquired 4 years ago through a subsidiary. I own the debt, I said, the realization settling heavy in my chest. I own him. If I made a single phone call to the collections department at Apex, I could foreclose on Graham's house by tomorrow morning. I could strip him of his car, his savings, and the little dignity he had left. It would be the ultimate revenge. I could crush the man who called me a failure using the very success he claimed I did not have. But as I looked at Caleb's terrified face, I knew I could not do it that way. Destruction was easy. Dismantling a lie so that the truth could never be buried again, that required precision. I am not going to sue him, I said, closing the tablet. And I am not going to scream at him. What are you going to do? Caleb asked, his voice trembling. I looked out the window at the dark silhouette of the town that had never understood me. I am going to save him from himself, whether he likes it or not, I said. And I am going to make sure Brielle and Jonah have nowhere to hide. I turned to Mara. Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I commanded. Location the Vailcrest Initiative headquarters. Get the auditors. Get the federal investigator we have on retainer, and get the file ready. In the invitation list, Mara asked, Tell Graham and Brielle that the primary investor of their loan demands an immediate compliance review, I said, feeling the cold resolve harden like steel. Do not tell them who the investor is. Just tell them attendance is non-negotiable. They will think it is a standard audit, Caleb said, understanding dawning in his eyes. They will think they can charm their way out of it, I replied. But tomorrow, nobody is going to be charmed. They are going to be processed. The silence in the hotel room was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I sat on the edge of the king-sized mattress, holding a small, creased photograph I had kept in my wallet for 15 years. It was a picture of Graham and me at a baseball game when I was 12. He was not smiling, but his hand was resting protectively on my shoulder. That was the tragedy of Graham Hart. He was not a villain in a black cape. He was a man who loved performative virtue, a man who wanted to be good so badly that he became easy prey for anyone who reflected that goodness back at him. A knock at the door broke the stillness. I stood up and checked the peephole before opening it. Caleb stood in the hallway. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were rimmed with red. He walked in and sat heavily in the armchair near the window. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I am sorry, Caleb said finally, his voice cracking. I should have left with you. I should have walked out the moment he called security. You stayed to make sure he did not have a heart attack, I said, pouring him a glass of water from the carafe on the desk. You are the good son. Caleb. You always have been. Caleb shook his head violently. No, I was afraid. But tonight, watching you stand there while they lied about you, I realized something. He looked up at me, his eyes fierce. You are not a failure. Rowan, you never were. You were just told wrong. They wrote a script for you, and they punished you every time you refused to read the lines. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged the reality of my existence. It felt like a weight lifting off my chest, a physical release of tension I had carried since I was a teenager. I have something, Caleb said. He pulled his phone from his pocket. I was in the study last week. Brielle and Jonah were on the patio. The door was cracked open. I started recording because I had a bad feeling. He pressed play. The audio was grainy, mixed with the sound of wind and distant traffic, but the voices were unmistakable. We need another 50,000 by Friday, Jonah's voice said, slick and dismissive. The offshore accounts are hungry. Graham is tapped out, Brielle's voice replied. She sounded annoyed, not worried. I can get him to sign a lien on the lake house, but he is starting to ask questions. If the feds come looking, Jonah said, we stick to the plan. Graham signed the papers. Graham is the director. We are just the innocent kids who trusted Daddy. Pin it on the old man. He will believe whatever I cry about. Brielle laughed. He always does. The recording ended. My hands were shaking. It was not just fraud. It was patricide by paperwork. They were building a coffin for my father out of legal documents and planning to bury him in it while he was still breathing. We need to take this to the police, Caleb said, standing up. Right now. This proves everything. No, I said. The word tasted bitter. My lawyer says if we move too fast, Jonah will run. He has flight funds stashed in 3 different currencies. If we spook him tonight, he disappears, and Graham is left holding the bag for all the debt. We need to trap him. Before Caleb could argue, his phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a photo of our father. Caleb put it on speaker. Where are you? Graham's voice barked out. He sounded drunk and exhausted. I am out, Caleb stammered. Are you with her? Graham demanded. Because if you are conspiring with that girl, if you take her side against your sister, do not bother coming home. You hear me? You choose her, and you are done. The line went dead. Caleb looked at the phone, his face pale. He is digging his own grave, I said softly, and he is handing Brielle the shovel. I walked over to the desk where Mara had left the case files. There was one document I had been avoiding. It was a digital scan of the anonymous letter sent to Graham 15 years ago, the one that claimed I had stolen my tuition money to buy drugs. That letter was the reason Graham had kicked me out. I pulled out a thank you card Brielle had written to a donor last week. I placed them side by side. The loops on the Y and the sharp, aggressive slant of the T were identical. It was her, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a mistake. Brielle wrote the letter. She was 19. She destroyed my life because she wanted the tuition money for a car. Caleb looked at the handwriting match, and I saw the last of his childhood illusions shatter. What are we going to do? Caleb asked. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. I felt a cold, surgical calm settle over me. I am going to give him one chance. I said, tomorrow morning, at the meeting, I will put the truth on the table. If he picks it up, I will mitigate the damage. I will pay the debts and restructure the mess so he does not go to prison. But if he chooses the lie, if he chooses her again. I turned back to my brother. Tomorrow. They do not get to tell the story about me anymore. I said, tomorrow. I hold the pen. The conference room at the Vallecrest Initiative was a glass cage suspended on the 14th floor, offering a panoramic view of the gray Illinois sky. I sat at the head of the mahogany table. To my right sat Mara, my lawyer, a forensic accountant from a top-tier firm, and Special Agent Miller, a federal investigator who wore a suit that cost less than his shoes, but carried a badge that weighed more than everything else in the room. We were not there to negotiate. We were there to dissect a corpse before the heart had officially stopped beating. The doors swung open at exactly 9 o'clock. Graham walked in first. He adjusted his tie, his chin lifted in that familiar, arrogant tilt. He did not look like a man facing a federal inquiry. He looked like a father arriving to accept an apology. Brielle followed him, clutching a designer handbag that I knew was purchased with stolen donor funds. She looked pale, her eyes darting around the room, but she forced a tight, plastic smile when she saw me. I am glad you finally came to your senses. Rowan, Graham said, pulling out a chair and sitting down without waiting to be invited. He gestured to Brielle to sit beside him. I expect a full retraction of the accusations made last night. and I expect you to apologize to your sister for the scene you caused. If you do that, we can discuss limiting your embarrassment. I did not speak. I simply looked at the empty chair next to Brielle. Where is Jonah? I asked. Brielle stiffened. Jonah is under the weather. He could not make it. I am representing the board today. Jonah is not sick, Mara said, her voice dry and clinical. Jonah booked a one-way ticket to Belize on a flight that departed 40 minutes ago. He did not board it, however, because he realized his passport had been flagged. Brielle's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Graham frowned, looking between us with growing irritation. What are you talking about? Graham demanded. This is a family meeting to settle a dispute. This is a deposition, I said. I signaled to the forensic accountant. He dimmed the lights and projected a complex flow chart onto the smart screen behind me. It was a map of the Vale Crest Initiative's finances. It looked less like a charity and more like a sewer system. These are the donation logs for the past 12 months, the accountant explained, using a laser pointer to trace the red lines. You raised over $2 million for veteran housing. Only $40,000 reached any legitimate construction firms. The rest was funneled here, and here. He pointed to 3 boxes labeled with obscure names. Shell corporations. The accountant continued. Registered in jurisdictions with zero transparency. And the signatory for the transfer orders Brielle Vale. Graham stared at the screen. He squinted, trying to make the numbers fit the story he wanted to believe. This is a mistake, Graham said, his voice wavering slightly. Brielle handles the outreach. Jonah handles the finances. She would not know how to. She knew enough to forge your signature on the authorization forms. Mara interrupted. She slid a stack of papers across the table. They stopped right in front of Graham's hands. Do you recognize these? You signed them 3 weeks ago? You thought they were venue insurance forms. They are actually personal guarantees for high-risk liquidity loans. Graham picked up the papers. His hands began to shake. He read the fine print, his face draining of color until it looked like gray putty. I did not read the second page, Graham whispered. She said it was standard procedure. It is standard procedure if you are framing someone. I said. I placed my phone on the table and pressed play on the recording Caleb had given me. The room filled with the tinny, undeniable sound of Jonah's voice pin it on the old man, and then Brielle's laugh. He will believe whatever I cry about. The silence that followed was suffocating. Graham slowly turned his head to look at Brielle. It was the look of a man watching his house burn down while he was still inside it. You, Graham choked out. I defended you. I threw my own daughter out on the street for you. Brielle did not apologize. She did not beg. She snapped. The facade crumbled, revealing the ugly, jagged jealousy underneath. She stood up, knocking her chair back. So what? Brielle screamed, her face twisting. You talk about family. You treat me like a trophy, and her. She pointed a trembling finger at me. She abandoned you. She ran off and got rich while I stayed here and listened to your boring stories. Why does she get to win? Why does she get everything? She turned to me, her eyes wet with rage. You think you are so special because you have money now, Brielle spat. You are still just the girl nobody wanted. I did not come here because I have money, I said quietly. I came here because I hate thieves. Special Agent Miller cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but it stopped Brielle cold. Mr. Reed attempted to wire the remaining balance of the charity's accounts, approximately $600,000, to an offshore bank at 8:30 this morning, Miller said, reading from his tablet. He was trying to liquidate the entire fund before fleeing. Graham put his head in his hands. It is gone. It is all gone. Actually, it is not, Miller said. He looked at Graham with a strange expression. The transfer failed. The receiving bank froze the assets immediately. It seems the controlling shareholder of the financial institution that holds the debt, exercised a clause to lock all associated accounts due to suspicious activity. Graham looked up, confusion warring with his despair. Who, Graham asked, his voice barely audible. Who stopped it? The bank. Not the bank, sir, Miller said, glancing at me but obeying my instruction to stay silent on the specifics. The investor who owns the liability. The one who essentially owns your debt right now? Graham looked around the room, bewildered. He knew someone had saved him from total bankruptcy, but he had no idea that the person holding the keys to his shackles and his salvation was the daughter sitting right across from him. He still thought I was just a bitter woman with a lawyer. He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. The heavy glass door slammed against the wall, shattering the calculated silence of the room. Jonah Reed marched in, but the smooth, confident man from the society pages was gone. In his place was a desperate animal with sweat-stained collars and wild eyes. He did not look at me. He lunged toward Graham, slamming his palms onto the mahogany table. "You need to call the bank," Graham Jonah shouted, his voice cracking. They locked the transfer. "Tell them it is authorized. If I go down for this, I swear to God, I am taking you with me. I have your signature on every single document." Graham recoiled, pressing his back against his chair. He looked at the man he thought was a perfect son-in-law. Then he looked at Brielle. "Jonah," Graham stammered. "What are you saying?" You said this was just a liquidity issue. It is a prison issue. You old fool," Jonah spat. "And you are the one who signed the checks." I did not yell. I did not stand up. I simply reached for my phone on the table and tapped the screen. The audio file Caleb had recorded began to play through the conference room speakers, loud and clear. "Pin it on the old man." Jonah's voice sneered from the device. "He will believe whatever I cry about." Brielle's voice laughed in response. I stopped the recording. Graham looked as if he had been physically struck. The color drained from his face, leaving him a terrifying shade of gray. He turned slowly toward Brielle. His lips trembled. Brielle, Graham asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What have you done?" Brielle did not scream this time. She did not throw herself on the floor or invent a story about a stolen necklace. She sat perfectly still, staring at her hands. It was the silence of a cornered rat that realizes there are no more holes in the wall. It was the silence of total guilt. "She cannot answer you," I said, my voice cutting through the tension, "because there is no lie left that fits this situation." I picked up the thick envelope my lawyer had placed in front of me. I slid a single document across the polished wood until it rested directly beneath Graham's nose. "You asked who blocked the transfer," I said. "You asked who owns the debt that is currently hanging over your head like a guillotine." Graham looked down at the paper. It was a notarized declaration of beneficial ownership. "I am the sole beneficiary and managing director of the Hartwell Trust," I stated, my tone devoid of emotion. "I also hold the controlling interest in Apex Ventures and the Orchid Rail payment grid. My current net worth is approximately $3 billion. No one gasped. No one clapped. The room was so quiet that the sound of the pages turning seemed to echo off the vaulted ceiling. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs when a truth is so massive it sucks the oxygen out of the air. Graham stared at me, his eyes wide, trying to reconcile the daughter he had called a failure with the woman who could buy and sell his entire existence before lunch. Jonah slumped into a chair, realizing he had just threatened the one person in the room who could bury him under a mountain of litigation. "I am not here to destroy this family," I continued, standing up and buttoning my coat. "I am not you, Dad. I do not use my power to humiliate people. I have already forwarded the forensic accounting files to the FBI. They are freezing Jonah's personal assets as we speak. I am forcing a restructuring of the Vailcrest initiative to ensure every cent goes to the veterans you promised to help." I looked at Graham. He was crying now, silent tears tracking through the wrinkles on his cheeks. "You kicked me out of a party to protect a lie," I said, looking him dead in the eye. I used the thing you always despised the truth to protect the people you almost destroyed. Graham covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. He finally understood. He realized that while he was busy polishing his reputation, I had been building an empire. He realized that the daughter he threw away was the only one who had ever actually loved him enough to save him. "I am sorry," Graham choked out. He looked up, his eyes red and broken. He turned to the federal agent and reached for the pen. "I will sign the cooperation agreement. I will testify against Jonah." He paused, then looked around the room, addressing everyone. "Rowan is my daughter," Graham said, his voice firm for the first time that morning. "And I lied about her. I was wrong. I did not stay for a hug. I did not stay for the reconciliation." The knot was untied. I nodded once to Mara, turned on my heel, and walked out of the glass room. I moved down the hallway toward the elevator, my steps echoing on the floor, leaving the past behind me where it belonged. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to this story. I really want to know where you guys are tuning in from. So drop a comment down below with your city or country. It is always awesome to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed the ride, please smash that like button, hit the hype button to help us reach more people, and make sure you are subscribed to Victoria Revenge Stories so you never miss a beat. Catch you in the next one.